Welcome to the Deep Macro Future Finance podcast. Today we have Mr. Hiroshi Nakaso. He is the Daiwa Institute of Research chairman and was previously the deputy governor of the Bank of Japan. He had a long career at the bank that involved many positions, too long for me to mention, before becoming the deputy governor. And so we wanted to sit down with Mr. Nakaso and to talk about monetary policy and general economic issues today. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I wanted to just hit it right at the beginning on monetary policy. We have very high inflation globally, and a lot of people are saying that this is like the 1970s. What is your general view on this? And what are some of the similarities, if there are any, and what are the differences, if there are any?
Well, thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. It's very nice to see you again, despite online. Yes, the inflation in the 1970s was driven by higher oil prices and exacerbated by speculative demand. I was a teenage boy during Japan's so-called oil shock of 1973. And remember my mother running to supermarkets to buy toilet paper rolls. Well, this time around, although it looks similar on surface, in that the inflation is driven by higher energy prices, I think this time around it's more complex. The inflation was initiated by disruption in supply chain and logistics caused by the pandemic. And now this is compounded by Russian aggression on Ukraine that is pushing the cost of energy and food prices higher. So what began as a cost push, supply shock, inflation, I think is now transforming itself into a kind of second round inflation in which wider items, including services, cost of services, increase, and the price wage dynamics also changes. So in short, all the good things that we believed in or took for granted in globalization, I think are unwinding and causing higher inflation.
Okay, well, that's interesting because there are also a lot of other structural factors because before the pandemic and the war, inflation had been fairly low for a long time, partially thanks to globalization, but there are also structural factors people have talked about, such as high levels of debt, aging demographics, and technology, which gets better and better over time. Have these factors gone away or become weaker?
No, I think they haven't gone away. I think, in fact, I think the recent experience underscores the significance of structural reforms or growth strategy in the Japanese context to raise potential growth rates from the supply side, I should say. I want to reiterate that there has been a secular decline in the potential growth rates almost across the board since the global financial crisis. Growth expectation became lower and growth in capital stock deteriorated. Innovation remained generally sluggish, while demographics continue to bite in the into the economy. Thus, all important drivers of potential growth rate has become rather lackluster in the last decade, I think. In my view, people refrain from taking meaningful structural reforms measures, which often accompany pains. Some monetary accommodation made it too comfortable, let's say, to take painful reform measures when it was badly needed. So in retrospect, we should have embarked on structural reforms when easy monetary policy could have alleviated pains of structural reform, but it's never too late. I think we need to focus now more than ever on structural reforms to expand the supply capacity and improve productivity that better absorbs inflation pressures.
Okay. Let me also talk about kind of the near term, because inflation has been higher than almost any economist, almost any central bank predicted. And it seems like, there has been a mistake. Do you think that this has damaged credibility of central banks? And do you think they should change the way they communicate with the public, given how difficult it is to forecast inflation and macroeconomic growth?
Yeah, generally speaking, I think this 2% inflation target still holds for many advanced economies. In the U.S. and the euro area, various ways of measuring inflation expectation, ranging from, let's say, market indices to surveys, pointed to the fact that inflation expectation have been fairly well anchored around 2% for a long time. It is true in that that they face the rising inflation. In the face of the rising inflation, Fed and ECB are trying very hard to anchor inflation expectation. Now, for central bankers, inflation expectation is such an important notion, since it's a kind of norm with which people decide how much sales prices or wages should be raised in a given year. Moreover, central bankers know once inflation expectations is de-anchored, it is very hard to re-anchor it. The Bank of Japan's experience is an example where inflation expectation in Japan had long been anchored around zero under deflation. I think to get out the deflationary spiral, the QQE aggressive monetary policy succeeded in de-anchoring it, but is still in transition to yet to be anchored at around 2%. I think the BOJ may be trying to take advantage of the current pressure on inflation, which is now slightly above 2%, to re-anchor inflation expectation around 2%. So I think I can say that major central banks believe 2% inflation target is still relevant over the medium term, during which period the current inflationary pressure is expected to subside. So I think it's yet to be seen whether they have retained credibility or not.
Okay.
They may, turn out to be quite successful.
Okay, good. It sounds like you're coming up with an idea of opportunistic reflation instead of opportunistic disinflation, like we saw in the 1990s, at least in Japan's case. Well, in many, especially the Fed, seems to be trying to front load rate hikes now, let's say. But I think the idea is they do want to get back inflation back to target, and it's probably better to raise rates more aggressively now to prevent further pain down the road. Do you think that they can bring inflation back to target without crushing economic growth? Because certainly in the markets, the last few weeks, the debate is shifting, and a lot more people are talking about the R word, the recession. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. Can central banks reduce the inflation rate meaningfully without triggering a big recession?
Yeah, okay. I think the focal point is now on the US. I think it is true that the generous kind of fiscal and monetary measures helped the economy to get out of the pandemic shock. But at the same time, this was brought about at the cost of higher inflation, I think. Now, to curb inflation, as you said, the Fed is expected to raise policy rates quicker than had been widely expected. And if you look at the markets, they expect Fed fund rates will reach around 3.5% or more by the year end. Slower U.S. growth, as you say, is inevitable. But the good news, I think, is that the U.S. economy is in relatively good shape, resilient. By which I mean the corporate sector remains generally profitable, and households retain a large amount of what may be called excess savings as a result of very generous fiscal support extended to households and individuals during the pandemic. So I think the private sector is better positioned to withstand expected kind of economic headwind. And moreover, I should say that unlike in the GFC, global financial crisis, the financial system is this time around in a good shape and expected to continue to support the economic recovery. So I think there may well be a kind of recession down the road, but most likely, and hopefully, of course, it is going to be a mild recession without a big increase in unemployment.
Okay, let me shift gears a little bit away from just strictly monetary issues. I wanted to ask about China. China has been an important driver of global growth in the last decade, last 2 decades, let's say. But it seems to have shifted dramatically to emphasize social issues over economic growth. Do you think this will damage global growth?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question. Now, China, as you know, is pushing the so-called zero COVID policy. And as a result, I foresee more cycles of lockdowns down the road, which will result in a kind of zigzag growth pattern, so to speak. Lockdown, growth, and then lockdown, and then slow down again. Although China has more monetary and fiscal space to support the economy, typically in the traditional area of infrastructure investment, the overall growth rates will be lower anyway than otherwise with the zero COVID policy. Like, the China's Q2 GDP at 0.4% on a year-on-year basis was the lowest in decades, except, of course, for the Q1 of 2020, when the economy was directly hit by the COVID. So, given the result thus far, including the effects of lockdowns, I think it is. Even if the Chinese economy recovers to some extent in the second half of this year, it will be difficult to reach the official target of 5.5%. And economists expect here it will end up somewhere around 3.5%. So as you say, it will be inevitable that the slower Chinese growth will negatively affect the global economy. And besides, I want to point out that the Chinese economy has some problems with the real estate sector, which I have been following. The housing prices are declining, in particular in local cities, and the sales of house sales has dropped accordingly. I'm told that some real estate developing projects face difficulties and causing problems with some developers. And since their debt level is already high, very highly leveraged, and given that some of these companies have international exposures, I think the health of China's housing sector, real estate sector, needs to be carefully monitored, as I said, as it can affect the rest of the world through what may be called financial channels, as well as the real economic channel.
Okay. Then on Japan, you've mentioned some things about the Japanese growth picture, inflation expectations, etc. In the West, we talk about Japan's lost decades quite a lot. What is the one thing about the Japanese economy that you think most foreign observers get wrong?
Yeah, I think Japan's economy has had a kind of a long image of sunsetting economy and remained on the sidelines for a long time, in contrast to the rising dragon. I think this perspective may shift against the backdrop of rapidly changing global economy, finance, and of course geopolitics. Japan is an open and mature economy based on the firm belief in free trade and investment. It is a trusted member of the democratic community with which it shares the basic value. And it has the social and political stability. Prime Minister Kishida, by the way, has the highest approval rate among the G7 countries. The ruling parties hold a majority in both houses as a result of the latest election, upper-house election. And I think this will provide the Prime Minister with better chances to demonstrate his leadership in the coming years. These are fundamental factors that the global community will focus on in a world with rising uncertainties. So I think there's a good chance that Japan will re-emerge, so to say, with a kind of new image. We see some early signs. For example, in the area of trade, UK has asked for the membership of TPCPP, the initiative that Japan took the lead. The UK application is dealt with on a first come, first served basis, and I think membership will be granted. Meanwhile, PE funds, private equity funds are arriving in Japan with the aim of long-term investment in firms that have potential to transform Japanese economy. I think decarbonization is one area where Japanese companies, including SMEs, are renowned to have some cutting-edge environmental technologies. So for these reasons, I think there's a good chance that Japan re-emerges with a new image.
Okay, excellent. I hope so. Continuing on some of the globalization and deglobalization themes you mentioned before, maybe on the, well, possibly less optimistic side, certainly right now, but the war in Ukraine has just really been an enormous near-term shock, both politically and economically. What sort of, do you anticipate any longer-term impacts, and if so, in what areas?
Now sanctions are binding. Exclusion of Russian banks from SWIFT and freezing of Russian central banks' overseas assets makes it difficult for Russia to settle bills in US dollars or in other key currencies, including the Japanese yen. And moreover, I hear discussions are ongoing to escalate sanctions depending on how things are going to unfold. For example, by prohibiting Russian tanker vessels carrying Russian crude oil from accessing to Lloyd's of London insurance and reinsurance schemes. So powerful as these sanctions may be, the instruments used as means of sanctions, like the SWIFT or the dollar, use of dollar as a key currency, were all, in my view, public goods that anyone, regardless of political regime, was able to use in the peaceful days. So denying access to these public goods will drive them ultimately to come up with alternative public goods on their own, and that will eventually leave us in a more kind of fragmented global economy. I think this is already taking place to some extent. Russia has, for example, fairly big FX reserves amounting to $600 billion. But the composition has changed dramatically since the Crimean annexation. The dollar portion declined from 40 to 16%. The Chinese renminbi, in the meantime, increased from 0 to 14% in the corresponding period. The PBOC, meanwhile, has launched in 2015 a smart wholesale payment system called the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or the CIPS, as they call it, that specializes renminbi cross-border payment clearing. Russian banks, along with other Western global banks, and of course Japanese mega banks, participate in this system. This implies Russia can use a renminbi portion of the FX reserves for cross-border payments. Thus, it could encourage further de-dollarization that decouples Russia's economy to become a part of the greater Chinese economic and currency zone. And I'm also informed, I'm told by the business circle in Japan and Asia Pacific that weaponizing, if you like, the sanctions could ultimately result in more fragmented and economic financial blocks, as well as a permanent increase in inflationary pressure, because business firms must now relocate supply chains to either onshoring, nearshoring, or friendshoring, and duplicate investments. So in other words, they must place priority on resilience over efficiency, which has long been the standard. In the Japanese context, this means business principles must shift from just in time to just in case.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. You also mentioned decarbonization, and I know that Japan has had some initiatives in sustainable finance. Could you go through what you mean by sustainable finance and what Japan's role in that is going to be?
Okay, I think this also has to do with the kind of global energy crunch caused by Russia's invasion on Ukraine. I think this highlighted the importance of transition financing that allows for financing amber type of investment in cleaner energy source, such as liquid natural gas, in transition to carbon neutrality. Decarbonization requires a huge amount of capital investment, which cannot be financed by public funds alone. And in this regard, Japan has a relative advantage, I think, in that the household financial assets have been accumulated to reach 2,000 trillion yen, and half of it which remains asleep, so to speak, in saving accounts. So I think the role of Japan's financial center, therefore, should be to initiate virtuous cycle that allows the funds to successfully channel through to investments needed to decarbonize the economy. Now, Japan has a multi-layered industrial structure that comprises many Mittelstand companies. And since not all of them can go green overnight, it will be necessary to provide them with a transitory framework in which they can move in steps to eventually become carbon neutral. And this is why I think transition finance plays such a crucial role in Japan and elsewhere, that take care of the big financing needs that will arise during the transition process. And in this regard, I like to reiterate the two following points. 2 points. First, transition finance should be used not only for investment in energy saving and efforts to utilize cleaner fossil fuels, but also for R&Ds, research and developments for new energy sources like hydrogen, ammonium, as well as innovative carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and storage technologies, including, of course, deployment. That's the first point. And secondly, I believe that Tokyo should serve as a kind of financial center where banks and investors meet the financing needs of not only Japanese companies, but also companies in Asia-Pacific region that constitute the supply chain and faces a similar challenge to become green. I think in this way, Tokyo's financial center can contribute to decarbonization and ultimately the shift to sustained growth of the economies in the Asia-Pacific. I think Tokyo must have the perspective to serve not only Japan, but also the economies in the Asia-Pacific region by focusing on transition financing, which is a crucial step to become carbon neutral.
Okay, well, very good. We're pretty much at the end of our time here. So, Mr. Nakaso, I wanted to thank you for your appearance and all your wonderful thoughts on inflation, the global economy, and hopefully more on the sustainable finance side than on the deglobalization side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My pleasure. Good to see you.
The content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. Nothing contained in this material constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, endorsement, or offer by Deep Macro Incorporated or any third-party service provider to buy or sell any securities or other financial instruments in this or in any other jurisdiction in which such solicitation or offer would be unlawful under the securities laws of such jurisdiction. All content is information of a general nature and does not address the circumstances of any particular individual or entity. None of the information constitutes professional and/or financial advice, nor does any of the information constitute a comprehensive or complete statement of the matters discussed or the law relating thereto. There are risks associated with investing. Loss of principal is possible. Some high-risk investments may use leverage, which will accentuate gains and losses of securities or firms. Past investment performance is not a guarantee or predictor of future investment performance.